Sarah Mitchell stood at the entrance of the military recruitment office, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for the door handle. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, and she could feel the weight of curious eyes on her back. At 23 years old, she had made a decision that would change her life forever, but she had no idea just how much that change would affect not only her future, but also force her to confront a past she had tried so hard to forget. The tattoo on her left forearm was partially visible beneath her rolled-up sleeve. It was an intricate design that most people assumed was just another piece of body art, something chosen on a whim during a rebellious phase. The pattern looked like abstract waves intertwined with what appeared to be random symbols. Some thought it was beautiful, others found it strange, but nobody truly understood what it meant. Sarah had learned to live with the curious glances and occasional questions. She had prepared a simple answer that satisfied most people without revealing the truth. Inside the recruitment office, Sergeant Davis looked up from his desk and offered a welcoming smile. He was a middle-aged man with gray hair at his temples and a demeanor that put nervous recruits at ease. Sarah had done her research. She knew that joining the military was not just about physical fitness and following orders. It was about becoming part of something larger than herself, finding purpose, and perhaps finding a way to finally move forward from the shadows of her past. The recruitment process was thorough and demanding. Sarah filled out endless forms, answered countless questions about her background, education, and medical history. When asked about her tattoo, she gave her rehearsed response. It was a personal design, she explained, something that reminded her of home and family. The sergeant nodded and moved on to the next question. Nobody pressed further. Nobody needed to know more. Weeks turned into months as Sarah went through basic training. The physical challenges were intense, pushing her body to limits she never knew existed. Wake-up calls before dawn, obstacle courses that left her muscles screaming in protest, and drill sergeants who seemed to take pleasure in finding weaknesses to exploit. But Sarah discovered something unexpected during those grueling days. She was stronger than she thought, more resilient than she had given herself credit for, and the structure of military life provided a sense of stability she had been missing. Her fellow recruits came from all walks of life. There was Marcus, a kid from Chicago who joined to escape gang violence in his neighborhood. Jennifer, a college graduate who wanted to serve her country before pursuing law school. David, whose father and grandfather had both been military men, carrying on a family tradition. They became a unit, learning to trust each other, to cover each other's backs, and to push through pain and exhaustion together. The tattoo remained a topic of occasional curiosity among her peers. During shower time or while changing in the barracks, someone would notice it and ask about its meaning. Sarah always smiled and gave vague answers. It represented her journey, she would say. It was about overcoming challenges. Most people accepted these explanations and moved on. But there was one person who seemed to look at the tattoo with more intensity than others. Lieutenant Caroline Hayes was one of the training officers, a woman in her mid-30s with sharp eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She had served multiple tours overseas and had earned respect through both her competence and her genuine care for the soldiers under her command. Whenever Lieutenant Hayes was near, Sarah felt an inexplicable tension. It was as if the officer could see through her carefully constructed walls. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day of combat training exercises, Sarah sat alone in the barracks, writing a letter home. Her mother had been supportive of her decision to enlist, though Sarah could hear the worry in her voice during their phone calls. Her younger brother, Tommy, thought it was cool that his sister was becoming a soldier. He had asked if she would get to drive tanks and shoot big guns. Sarah had laughed and told him maybe someday. As she wrote, she unconsciously traced the pattern of her tattoo with her other hand. It had become a habit, a nervous gesture that surfaced when she was deep in thought or feeling vulnerable. The tattoo had been with her for 5 years now, but the memories it represented were much older, buried deep in a part of her mind she tried not to visit too often. The truth was that Sarah had grown up in a small coastal town where everyone knew everyone else's business. Her father had been a fisherman, spending weeks at sea before returning home with stories of massive waves and schools of fish so thick you could walk on them. Her mother worked at the local diner, serving coffee and pie to the same customers year after year. It was a simple life, peaceful and predictable. Everything changed the summer Sarah turned 16. Her father's boat, the Sea Promise, had gone out for what should have been a routine fishing trip. A storm system moved in faster than anyone predicted. The Coast Guard issued warnings, but by then, it was too late. 3 boats were caught in the tempest, battered by winds that reached nearly 100 miles per hour and waves that towered like moving mountains. 2 of the boats made it back to port, damaged but intact. The Sea Promise and its crew of 4 men never returned. Search and rescue operations continued for days, but the ocean kept its secrets. Sarah's father and his crew were declared lost at sea. The entire town mourned. Fishing communities understood the risks, respected the power of the ocean, but that knowledge did nothing to ease the pain of loss. Sarah's mother fell into a depression that lasted months. Tommy, only 9 years old at the time, didn't fully understand that his father was never coming home. He kept asking when Daddy would be back, what presents he would bring, whether they could go fishing together like he promised. Each question was a knife in Sarah's heart. She tried to be strong for her family. She took on extra responsibilities, helping her mother pay bills, making sure Tommy got to school, keeping the house running. But inside, she was drowning in grief and unanswered questions. Why did her father have to die? Why couldn't they even recover his body to give him a proper burial? Why did the ocean, which had provided for their family for generations, take him away so cruelly? A year after the tragedy, on the anniversary of her father's disappearance, Sarah made a decision. She had saved money from her part-time job at the local grocery store. She walked into a tattoo parlor 2 towns over, where nobody would know her or ask uncomfortable questions. She brought with her a design she had created herself, working on it for months until it felt right. The tattoo artist, a woman with purple hair and gentle hands, asked if she was sure. Sarah was only 17, and this was clearly something significant. Sarah nodded. She was absolutely certain. The woman began her work, and for 2 hours, Sarah sat still as the needle etched permanent marks into her skin. The waves represented the ocean that had taken her father. But they weren't violent waves. She had drawn them flowing, continuous, eternal. Within the waves were symbols that her father had taught her. He used to draw patterns in the sand when she was little, teaching her about navigation, about reading the water, about understanding the language of the sea. She incorporated those symbols into her tattoo, hidden within the larger design where only someone who knew what to look for would recognize them. There was also something else, something even more personal. Woven into the pattern were the initials of each crew member who had been lost that day. J. M. for her father, James Mitchell. R. C. for Robert Cruz, who had a wife and 3 daughters. T. P. for Thomas Park, whose mother still left flowers at the dock every Sunday. M. L. for Michael Lopez, the youngest of the crew, only 24 years old with his whole life ahead of him. The tattoo was her way of carrying them with her. It was a memorial that nobody else could understand unless she chose to explain it. It was private grief, made visible, but still somehow hidden. Over the years, she had become skilled at deflecting questions, at protecting the true meaning from casual curiosity. Now, years later, and hundreds of miles from her hometown, Sarah found herself in an environment where that past felt both very distant and unexpectedly close. The military had its own relationship with loss. Soldiers understood sacrifice in ways civilians often couldn't. There was a camaraderie built on shared experiences, on knowing that the person next to you would put their life on the line for you without hesitation. As basic training progressed, Sarah excelled in areas that surprised even her. She had a natural aptitude for navigation and water-based operations. When their unit underwent survival training that included water scenarios, she moved through the exercises with a confidence that caught the attention of her instructors. Her childhood by the ocean, all those hours watching her father and listening to his lessons, had given her skills she didn't realize she possessed. Lieutenant Hayes seemed particularly interested in Sarah's abilities. After one training session where Sarah had successfully completed a complex water rescue simulation, the lieutenant approached her. They stood on the dock, both breathing heavily from the exertion, water dripping from their uniforms. The lieutenant's eyes dropped to Sarah's tattoo, visible now that the wet fabric clung to her arm. There was a moment of silence before she spoke. Her voice was thoughtful, almost gentle. She asked Sarah if she had ever considered specialized training. The military had programs for soldiers with particular skills, she explained. Water operations, coastal security, maritime interdiction. These were areas where Sarah's natural talents could be valuable. Sarah felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. Specialized training meant more scrutiny, more questions, deeper background checks. It meant the possibility that someone would eventually dig deep enough to understand what her tattoo really meant. But it also meant purpose, a way to honor her father's memory by mastering the element that had taken him. She told the lieutenant she would think about it. Lieutenant Hayes nodded and walked away, but not before giving Sarah one more long look. There was something in that gaze that made Sarah uncomfortable. It was as if the officer saw more than Sarah wanted to reveal. That night, Sarah lay in her bunk, staring at the ceiling while her fellow recruits slept around her. The barracks were never truly quiet. Someone always snored. Another person talked in their sleep. The building itself creaked and settled. But in those late hours, Sarah felt profoundly alone with her thoughts. She thought about her father, tried to remember his face clearly. Time had a way of softening memories, making them less sharp around the edges. She could recall his laugh, deep and genuine. She remembered how he smelled like salt and fish and diesel fuel when he came home from trips. She remembered his hands, weathered and strong, gentle when he ruffled her hair or tied a proper knot to teach her. What would he think of her now? Would he be proud that she had joined the military, that she was serving her country? Or would he worry, the way parents do, about the dangers she might face? The ocean had taught him respect for forces larger than himself. The military was teaching Sarah similar lessons about discipline, duty, and the weight of responsibility. The weeks continued to pass. Sarah's unit moved from basic training into more specialized instruction. They learned about weapons, maintenance, tactical communication, combat first aid. Each day brought new challenges, new skills to master. Sarah threw herself into every task with determination. She wanted to prove herself, wanted to show that she belonged here, that she was capable of handling whatever the military threw at her. Marcus became her closest friend in the unit. He had noticed early on that Sarah sometimes seemed lost in thought, staring at her tattoo with an expression that suggested painful memories. One evening, sitting outside the barracks during a rare free hour, he asked her about it directly. Not the meaning, but whether it represented something hard. Sarah appreciated his sensitivity. Most people either avoided the topic entirely or pushed too hard for details. Marcus found a middle ground. She told him it was about loss, about people who had been important to her. He nodded and shared his own story. His older brother had been shot in a drive-by when Marcus was 15. Random violence, wrong place, at wrong time. That's why he left Chicago, why he needed to find a different path. They sat together in companionable silence after that. Two people who understood that some pain never fully goes away. You just learn to carry it differently. As their training entered its final phase, word came down that a high-ranking officer would be visiting the base. Commander Richard Stone was a decorated naval officer with over 25 years of service. He had served on submarines, commanded surface vessels, and most recently worked in intelligence coordination. His visit was part of a routine inspection, evaluating training programs and identifying promising recruits for specialized assignments. The entire base went into preparation mode. Barracks were cleaned until they sparkled. Uniforms were pressed with military precision. Drill routines were practiced until every movement was synchronized. Sarah felt the same nervous energy that affected everyone else. Meeting a commander was significant, a moment that could potentially impact future assignments. The day of the inspection arrived with clear skies and unusual warmth. Sarah's unit stood in formation on the parade ground, rows of soldiers at attention, waiting for the commander's arrival. Sarah could feel sweat trickling down her back despite the morning hour. Her heart beat faster than normal, though she told herself it was just the standard anxiety that came with high-pressure situations. Commander Stone arrived in a military vehicle, stepping out with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. He was in his early 50s, with silver hair cut short and eyes that seemed to catalog everything in a single glance. Lieutenant Hayes and other officers greeted him formally, then began the inspection tour. The commander walked slowly down the lines of soldiers, occasionally stopping to ask questions, to inspect a uniform detail, to make a brief comment. Sarah kept her eyes forward, maintaining perfect posture, trying to blend into the formation. She wanted to make a good impression, but not draw particular attention. But as Commander Stone moved closer to her position, Sarah felt an inexplicable sense of recognition. Something about his face, the way he carried himself, stirred a memory she couldn't quite place. Had she seen him before? Had his picture been in the news? She dismissed the thought. There was no reason for their paths to have crossed. The commander stopped directly in front of her. Sarah kept her gaze fixed on a point in the distance, as protocol demanded. She could feel him studying her, taking in details. Then his eyes dropped to her left forearm, to the tattoo that was partially visible beneath her sleeve. The moment stretched impossibly long. Sarah held her breath, waiting for him to move on to the next soldier. But instead, Commander Stone did something unexpected. He reached out slowly, carefully, and gently turned her arm to see the full design of the tattoo. Sarah's heart nearly stopped. This was unusual, potentially inappropriate, yet something in his demeanor suggested this wasn't casual curiosity. His eyes traced the patterns, the waves, the hidden symbols. His face, which had been professionally neutral throughout the inspection, changed. Recognition dawned in his expression, followed quickly by something that looked like profound shock. The commander's voice, when he finally spoke, was barely above a whisper. He asked Sarah a question that made her entire world tilt on its axis. He asked if she knew what her tattoo really meant, if she understood the significance of the symbols she carried on her skin. Sarah's carefully constructed walls began to crack. Her voice shook slightly as she started to give her standard answer, the vague explanation she had perfected over years. But Commander Stone interrupted her gently. He told her that he recognized the pattern, that he knew exactly what those symbols represented, and where they came from. The formation around them seemed to fade away. Lieutenant Hayes stepped closer, sensing something significant was happening. Other officers watched with curiosity. Sarah's fellow recruits maintained their positions, but she could feel their attention shifting, wondering why the commander had stopped, why this moment was extending far beyond a routine inspection. Commander Stone asked Sarah for her full name. When she responded, telling him she was Sarah Mitchell, his face went pale. He asked about her hometown, her family. Each answer Sarah gave seemed to affect him more deeply. Finally, he asked about her father, about what had happened to him. Sarah's voice broke as she spoke. She told him about the fishing boat, about the storm, about the loss that had shaped her entire life. The words came harder than she expected, emotion rising in her throat. She had learned to talk about her father's death in clinical terms, keeping feelings at bay. But something about this moment, about the commander's reaction, broke through her defenses. What Commander Stone said next would change everything Sarah thought she knew about her father's death, about her tattoo, and about the secrets that had been kept from her for years. Commander Stone stood perfectly still, his weathered face showing emotions that military discipline usually kept hidden. The parade ground fell into an eerie silence, as every person present sensed something extraordinary unfolding. Sarah felt her legs trembling beneath her, though she fought to maintain her military posture. The commander looked at Lieutenant Hayes and quietly requested a private space where he could speak with Sarah immediately. Within minutes, Sarah found herself in a small office typically used for counseling sessions. Commander Stone sat across from her, his formal demeanor giving way to something more human, more vulnerable. Lieutenant Hayes stood near the door, her expression concerned and curious. The commander asked Sarah to show him her tattoo completely, to explain every symbol she had incorporated into the design. Sarah hesitated only briefly before rolling up her sleeve fully. She traced the pattern with her finger, explaining how the waves represented the ocean, how she had hidden her father's initials and those of his crew members within the design. She described the navigation symbols her father had taught her, the patterns he would draw in the sand during their beach walks. Each detail she revealed seemed to affect the commander more deeply, his jaw tightening, his eyes becoming distant as if he were seeing something from long ago. When Sarah finished her explanation, Commander Stone leaned back in his chair and released a long, shuddering breath. What he said next made Sarah's world completely collapse and rebuild itself in the span of a few sentences. The commander told her that he recognized those symbols because he had been there 5 years ago, during the storm that took her father's boat. He had been part of the rescue operation that searched for the Sea Promise and its crew. Sarah felt the room spin. She had never known the specific details of the search and rescue mission. Her family had been told that the Coast Guard and Navy had done everything possible, but the storm had been too severe, the ocean too violent. The official reports spoke of impossible conditions, of a search that continued for days despite minimal hope of finding survivors. What they had never been told, what had been classified for reasons of national security, was the full truth of what happened that night. Commander Stone began to speak, his voice heavy with memories he had carried for years. He explained that 5 years ago, he had been captain of a naval vessel conducting routine operations off the coast. When the storm warnings came through and civilian boats were reported in distress, his ship had been the closest military asset that could respond. They had rushed toward the coordinates where fishing vessels were struggling against the tempest. The conditions that night were beyond anything the commander had experienced in his 20 years of naval service at that time. Waves reaching 40 feet high, winds that made communication nearly impossible, rain so thick you couldn't see 10 feet in front of you. His crew had managed to locate 2 of the fishing boats and guided them towards safer waters. But the third boat, the Sea Promise, had disappeared from radar. Sarah listened with tears streaming down her face, finally hearing details that had been kept from her family. The commander continued, describing how his crew had searched through the night and into the following days. They had found debris, pieces of the boat scattered across miles of ocean. They had found life preservers, fishing equipment, personal belongings, but they never found the crew. What made the commander pause, what brought visible pain to his features, was what came next. On the 3rd day of searching, his crew had spotted something floating in the water. It was a waterproof container, the kind fishermen use to protect important documents and emergency supplies. Inside that container were several items that painted a picture of the Sea Promise's final moments. There was a logbook where Sarah's father had written entries up until minutes before the boat went down. There was a letter, hastily written in barely legible handwriting, addressed to his family. There were photographs, protected in plastic bags, showing Sarah, her mother, and Tommy. And there was something else. Something that had puzzled the commander for 5 years until this very moment. Among the items in the container was a piece of paper with symbols drawn on it, navigation markers, wave patterns, coastal signs that fishermen use to communicate and remember routes. The commander had studied those symbols, had included them in his report, but they had seemed like random notes from a fisherman's workday. Now, looking at Sarah's tattoo, he realized those symbols were identical to the ones on that paper. Her father had drawn them, perhaps in those final moments, perhaps thinking of the times he had taught his daughter about reading the ocean. The container and its contents had been turned over to the Coast Guard, which should have delivered everything to Sarah's family. But in the chaos of multiple rescue operations, administrative errors, and bureaucratic confusion, the container had been misplaced in a storage facility. It had been classified along with other sensitive materials from that operation because the Navy's involvement had raised questions about why a military vessel was in those waters, questions that touched on classified patrol routes and security protocols. Commander Stone had tried to locate the container after the operation concluded. He had wanted to ensure the family received their loved ones' final messages. But he had been transferred to a new assignment. The paperwork trail went cold, and despite his efforts, the container remained lost in the system. It had become one of his deepest regrets, a failure that haunted him even as he rose through the ranks and commanded increasingly important operations. Sarah could barely process what she was hearing. Her father had written them a letter. There were final words, final thoughts meant for his family, and for 5 years, those words had been sitting in a storage facility, forgotten and inaccessible. The anger that rose in her chest was almost overwhelming, but it was mixed with an equally powerful grief. To know that her father had thought of them, had tried to leave them something, made his loss feel fresh and raw all over again. The commander reached across the desk and placed his hand over Sarah's. It was an unusually personal gesture from a superior officer, but in that moment, rank and protocol seemed secondary to shared human sorrow. He told her that seeing her tattoo, understanding what it represented, felt like a message from the universe that his failure could finally be addressed. He promised her that he would personally ensure the container was located and delivered to her family. Lieutenant Hayes, who had been silent throughout this exchange, now spoke up. She asked the commander if he was certain about the contents of the container, if there was enough information to track it down after so many years. Commander Stone nodded firmly. He had never forgotten the case number, the date, the specific storage facility where classified materials from that operation had been sent. He had the authority now to cut through red tape that would have stopped him years ago. Sarah wiped her tears, trying to compose herself. She asked the commander if he could tell her what her father had written in the logbook, if he remembered any of the entries. The commander closed his eyes, and she could see him reaching back through years of memories. Countless operations, innumerable reports and incidents. But some things, he explained, stayed with you. Some moments were too significant to forget. He told her that her father's final log entries talked about the storm, about the increasingly dangerous conditions, but they also talked about his family. He had written about Sarah, about how proud he was that she helped her mother so much, about how she was growing into a remarkable young woman. He had written about Tommy, about teaching him to fish when the boy got older. He had written about his wife, about the life they had built together, about coming home to her cooking and her laugh. The last entry, written in shaky handwriting as the boat was being battered by waves, was brief. It said that if anything happened, his family should know he loved them more than the ocean was vast. He wasn't afraid of the water because the water had given him everything, his livelihood, his purpose, his connection to something greater than himself. He only regretted that he might not make it home to tell them all this in person. Sarah broke down completely. All the grief she had contained, all the questions she had carried, all the anger at an ocean that took without explanation, came pouring out in sobs that shook her entire body. Lieutenant Hayes moved closer and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. The commander sat quietly, giving her space to feel everything she needed to feel. When Sarah finally regained some composure, she asked why the Navy had been there that night. What had classified patrol routes to do with the fishing storm? The commander exchanged a glance with Lieutenant Hayes before answering. He explained that they couldn't discuss specific operational details, but he could tell her that naval vessels regularly patrolled coastal waters for security reasons. The fact that his ship was in position to respond to the distress calls was fortunate, even if the outcome wasn't what anyone hoped for. Something in his tone suggested there was more to the story, details that remained classified even now. Sarah didn't push. She understood that military service came with secrets, with information that couldn't be shared. What mattered was that the commander had been there, had tried to save her father, and had carried the weight of that night for years, just as she had. The commander stood and told Sarah that he needed to make some calls immediately. He would contact the Naval Archives, speak with officials who had authority over classified storage facilities, and personally ensure that the container was located and delivered to her family within weeks. He also told her something that surprised her. He said that her presence in the military, her choice to serve despite the loss she had suffered at the hands of the ocean during a military operation, showed a strength and forgiveness that humbled him. Sarah hadn't thought of it that way. She had joined the military to find purpose, to escape the small town where everyone knew her as the girl whose father died at sea. But perhaps, on some unconscious level, she had been seeking connection to the forces that shaped that tragedy. The military represented order in chaos, human effort to control and understand dangerous elements, the same drive that sent her father out onto the ocean day after day despite its risks. Lieutenant Hayes walked Sarah back to the barracks, giving her the rest of the day off from training. As they walked, the lieutenant spoke quietly about loss and service. She told Sarah that many people in the military carried similar stories. They were drawn to service because of tragedy, because of a need to make meaning from suffering, because protecting others helped heal the parts of themselves that felt broken. The lieutenant also mentioned that the commander's reaction to Sarah's tattoo was more than just recognition of symbols. She had served with Commander Stone on a previous assignment and knew him to be a man who took responsibilities seriously. perhaps too seriously. He carried the weight of every mission, every decision, every life lost under his watch or during his operations. Finding Sarah, discovering that she had memorialized her father with the same symbols he had seen in that recovered container, probably felt like fate giving him a chance to make amends. Back in the barracks, Sarah lay on her bunk, emotionally exhausted but unable to sleep. Her fellow recruits gave her space, having heard whispers about something significant happening during the commander's inspection. Marcus sat on the edge of her bunk and quietly asked if she was okay. Sarah told him she would be, eventually. She explained that she had just learned something about her father's death, something she had needed to know for years. Marcus didn't ask for details. He simply sat with her, offering silent companionship. After a while, he told her about a belief his grandmother used to share. She said that the people we love never truly leave us. They live on in the marks they make on our hearts, in the lessons they teach us, in the memories we carry. Looking at Sarah's tattoo, he said he thought her grandmother would have liked what Sarah had done, turning her pain into something beautiful and permanent. That evening, Sarah received a message that Commander Stone wanted to see her again before he left the base. She made her way to the administration building, where she found him in a conference room surrounded by papers and on the phone with various officials. When he saw her, he ended his call and smiled with genuine warmth. The commander told her that he had already made significant progress. He had located the storage facility, confirmed that materials from the rescue operation were still archived there, and initiated the process to have them retrieved and declassified. It would take some time. Paperwork had to be filed, permissions had to be obtained, but he was confident that within 3 to 4 weeks, her family would receive everything that had been in that container. Sarah thanked him, her voice thick with emotion. She told him that knowing her father's last thoughts, his last words, would mean everything to her mother and brother. The commander nodded and then said something that took Sarah completely by surprise. He told her that he had reviewed her training records, spoken with Lieutenant Hayes and other instructors, and was impressed with her performance and aptitude. He wanted to offer her an opportunity. The Navy had specialized units that worked in maritime operations, coastal defense, and search and rescue coordination. Given her natural skills with water operations and her personal understanding of maritime dangers, she would be an excellent candidate for advanced training. If she was interested, he could facilitate her transfer to a program that would allow her to develop those skills and potentially work in situations similar to the one that had taken her father. Sarah listened carefully. Part of her was immediately drawn to the idea. To work in search and rescue, to potentially save others from the kind of loss her family had experienced, felt like a way to honor her father's memory. But another part of her hesitated. Could she handle being constantly surrounded by the element that had taken him? Would every rescue remind her of the one that failed? The commander seemed to sense her internal conflict. He told her she didn't have to decide immediately. She should finish her basic training, take time to process everything she had learned today, discuss it with her family. But the opportunity would be available whenever she felt ready. He gave her his direct contact information, something highly unusual for a commander to give to a new recruit, and told her to reach out when she had made her decision. Before Sarah left, the commander asked her one more question. He wanted to know if she had designed her tattoo herself or if someone had helped her. When she explained that she had created the design entirely on her own, working from memories of her father's teachings, the commander looked amazed. He told her that the accuracy of the symbols, the way she had combined traditional maritime notation with personal meaning, showed a deep intuitive understanding that usually came only with years of professional experience. It was possible, he suggested, that her father had taught her more than either of them realized at the time. Children absorb information in ways adults often don't recognize. Those casual lessons on the beach, those explanations of navigation and ocean patterns, had given Sarah knowledge that surfaced years later in her tattoo design and in her natural aptitude for water-based operations. Sarah returned to the barracks that night with her mind racing. In a single day, her understanding of her past had been completely transformed. She had learned that her father's final moments were documented, that he had tried to send messages to his family, that a naval commander had carried guilt about that night for 5 years. She had been offered an opportunity to turn her loss into purpose, to work in a field that could prevent other families from experiencing similar grief. She pulled out her phone and called her mother. It was late, but her mother answered on the second ring, as she always did when Sarah called. Sarah tried to explain what had happened, but the words came out jumbled, mixing tears with excitement and grief with hope. Her mother listened patiently, asking her to slow down, to start from the beginning. As Sarah told the story more coherently, she heard her mother begin to cry on the other end of the line. The knowledge that her husband had written them a final letter, that he had thought of them in those last moments, was almost too much to bear. But there was also relief in her voice. For 5 years, Sarah's mother had wondered if he had suffered, if he had been afraid, if he had time to think of his family. Now she would know. The not knowing had been its own kind of torture. Sarah's brother got on the phone, wanting to know what was happening, why Mom was crying. Sarah explained in simpler terms that they would be receiving some things that belonged to Dad, including letters he had written. Tommy, now 14 and old enough to understand more fully what they had lost, went quiet for a moment before asking if Dad had mentioned him. Sarah assured him that he had, that Dad had written about teaching him to fish, about all the plans he had for when Tommy was older. After hanging up, Sarah sat in the darkness of the barracks, listening to the breathing of sleeping soldiers around her. She thought about the strange chain of events that had led to this day. Her decision to join the military, the random assignment to this particular base, the timing of Commander Stone's inspection visit, the moment when he happened to notice her tattoo. If any single element had been different, this revelation might never have occurred. Some people might call it fate or destiny. Others might say it was simply coincidence, random chance that happened to align in meaningful ways. Sarah didn't know what she believed. What she knew was that her tattoo, which she had gotten as a private memorial, had become the key to unlocking truth that had been hidden for years. She traced the pattern on her arm once more, seeing it differently now. It wasn't just her interpretation of her father's teachings. It was apparently an accurate representation of actual maritime navigation symbols, detailed enough that a naval commander could recognize them instantly. Her father had taught her a language she didn't know she was learning, and years later, that language had spoken across time and circumstance to bring answers to questions she had carried since she was 16. The next morning, Sarah returned to training with a renewed sense of purpose. The physical challenges felt different now. She wasn't just trying to prove herself or find stability. She was honoring her father's memory with every obstacle she overcame, every skill she mastered, every moment she refused to quit despite exhaustion or pain. Her fellow recruits noticed the change in her. Marcus commented that she seemed lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted. Sarah smiled and told him that she had gotten answers to some old questions. That was enough explanation for now. The full story would come out eventually, but for now, she wanted to sit with it privately, to process everything before sharing it widely. Lieutenant Hayes called her aside after a training exercise later that week. The lieutenant had spoken more with Commander Stone and wanted to give Sarah additional information about the specialized training opportunity. The program was highly competitive, she explained. It involved advanced swimming and diving certification, specialized rescue techniques, navigation in extreme conditions, and tactical water operations. The training was grueling, with a high washout rate, but those who completed it joined some of the most elite units in the naval service. Sarah asked what percentage of recruits successfully completed the program. Lieutenant Hayes smiled slightly and told her that historically, about 30% made it through. But looking at Sarah's performance, her natural abilities, and her personal motivation, the lieutenant believed she had better odds than most. The fact that she had already proven herself capable of facing her fears, of choosing to engage with the element that had caused her so much pain, suggested she had the mental toughness required. That evening, Sarah made her decision. She would accept Commander Stone's offer. She would pursue the specialized training. She would become the kind of person who could help in situations like the one that had killed her father. It wouldn't bring him back, wouldn't change what happened, but it would give her loss meaning. It would transform grief into purpose. She sent an email to the commander that night, formally expressing her interest in the program and thanking him again for everything he had done. His response came within hours. He told her that he had already initiated the paperwork for her transfer. Once she completed basic training, she would report to a different facility where the specialized program was conducted. He also informed her that the container with her father's belongings had been located and was being processed for release. Her family should receive it within 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Sarah counted the days, wondering what else her father had written, what photographs he had chosen to protect, what final messages he wanted his family to have. She also prepared herself mentally for the advanced training ahead. She began pushing herself even harder in physical conditioning, spending extra time in the pool, practicing swimming techniques, studying maritime navigation in the base library during free hours. The other recruits asked what she was preparing for. Sarah told them she had been selected for a specialized program after basic training. There was admiration in their responses, mixed with curiosity about what made her stand out. Sarah deflected the attention, insisting she had just gotten lucky with her background and skills. But inside, she knew it was more than luck. It was the culmination of a journey that had started with tragedy and was now transforming into something potentially redemptive. The package arrived at Sarah's family home on a Tuesday afternoon, delivered by 2 naval officers in full uniform. Sarah's mother called her immediately, her voice shaking as she described the official-looking container sitting on their kitchen table. Sarah told her mother to wait, not to open it alone. She requested emergency leave and drove through the night to get home, needing to be there when they finally saw what her father had left behind. Walking into her childhood home felt surreal. Everything looked the same, the furniture arranged as it had been for years, her father's fishing jacket still hanging by the door because her mother couldn't bring herself to put it away. But everything also felt different now, charged with the knowledge that they were about to receive a message from the past. Words from a man they had mourned without really saying goodbye. Sarah's mother looked older than her years, the stress of single parenthood and endless grief having taken its toll. Tommy had grown tall, almost as tall as their father had been, but he still had the uncertain movements of a teenager caught between childhood and adulthood. They sat together at the kitchen table, the 3 of them forming a small circle around the sealed container. The container itself was a sturdy, waterproof case, scratched and dented from its time in the ocean and then its years in storage. Official seals and tags documented its journey through the military bureaucracy. Sarah carefully broke the seals, her hands trembling slightly. Inside, protected by layers of plastic and desiccant packets, were the items Commander Stone had described. The logbook came out first. Sarah's mother reached for it with shaking hands, opening it to reveal pages of her husband's familiar handwriting. He had documented weather conditions, fishing locations, catch quantities, all the practical details of a working fisherman. But in the margins and in entries from the days before the storm, he had written personal notes, reminders to pick up supplies for Tommy's birthday, a note about taking his wife out for their anniversary, observations about the changing seasons and how the ocean felt different lately, restless and unpredictable. The final entries, written as the storm closed in, were harder to read. The handwriting grew messier as the boat pitched and rolled. He described the size of the waves, the speed of the wind, the terror and beauty of nature at its most powerful. He wrote that he had ordered his crew to put on life vests, to secure themselves, to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. He wrote that if these were his final words, he wanted his family to know they were his last thoughts. Sarah's mother pressed the logbook to her chest and wept. Tommy, trying to be strong but failing, put his arm around her shoulders. Sarah felt her own tears falling freely, not bothering to wipe them away. This was what they had needed for 5 years. This tangible connection to those final hours. This evidence that they had been loved and remembered even as death approached. Next came the letter, sealed in a plastic bag. Sarah's mother opened it carefully, and they read it together. The letter was written in rushed handwriting, water-stained despite the protective container, but still legible. It began simply, addressing each of them by name and telling them how much they meant to him. He apologized for not being more cautious, for not turning back when the weather first turned bad. He explained that fishermen sometimes made calculated risks, weighing the danger against the responsibility to bring home a catch, to provide for their families. But he wanted them to know that his work, his time on the ocean, had never been more important to him than they were. If he had any regrets, it was only that he wouldn't see Sarah graduate, wouldn't watch Tommy grow up, wouldn't grow old with the woman he had loved since high school. He told Sarah to be strong for her mother and brother, but not to sacrifice her own dreams for theirs. He told Tommy to listen to his mother, to work hard in school, to be good and kind, because that mattered more than being strong or successful. To his wife, he wrote the longest section. He thanked her for their life together, for every meal shared, every argument survived, every quiet evening when they sat together without needing to speak. He told her not to spend too much time grieving, to find joy again, to let their children see her smile. He wrote that the ocean had given him everything, including the ability to provide for his family, and if it was taking him now, he accepted that trade. It was the bargain every fisherman made, and he had always known the terms. The letter ended with instructions. There was a small amount of money hidden in the garage, behind the tool bench, for emergencies. There were insurance papers in his desk drawer that should help financially. He had spoken with his friend Robert about looking after the family if anything happened. And most importantly, he wanted them to remember him, but not let that memory become a prison. They should live fully, love deeply, and know that wherever he was at peace. The photographs came next, pictures he had chosen to keep with him on that final voyage. Sarah as a child, gap-toothed and grinning, holding up her first caught fish. Tommy as a baby, sleeping in his father's arms. Their wedding photo, two young people full of hope and promise. A family picture from the previous Christmas, all of them together, healthy and happy, and unaware that this would be their last holiday as a complete unit. Looking at these photos, chosen deliberately to be protected, Sarah understood something profound about her father. He had known the ocean's dangers. He had gone out that day understanding that storms could be unpredictable, that fishing was a profession that claimed lives. He had chosen to protect these images, to keep them close, suggesting he had at least considered the possibility that he might not return. Yet he had gone anyway, driven by duty and responsibility and love for his family. The final items in the container were the papers with navigation symbols, the ones that had puzzled Commander Stone until he saw Sarah's tattoo. Sarah spread them out on the table, and her mother made a small sound of recognition. She explained that Sarah's father used to make drawings like this all the time, teaching Sarah about the ocean, without either of them realizing how thoroughly the lessons were being absorbed. He had drawn these symbols on napkins during dinner, in the sand during beach trips, on the foggy bathroom mirror after showers. Sarah realized that when she designed her tattoo, she hadn't been making up symbols or randomly choosing patterns. She had been remembering, pulling from a deep well of knowledge that her father had filled throughout her childhood. The tattoo wasn't just a memorial. It was proof that teaching and love could transcend death, that the marks parents make on their children's lives persist in ways both visible and invisible. Her mother reached out and gently traced the tattoo on Sarah's arm, seeing it with new understanding. She told Sarah that her father would have loved knowing she carried his teachings on her skin, that she had transformed his lessons into art. Tommy asked if he could get a similar tattoo when he was older, something to honor their father. Sarah told him they could design one together, when he was ready, incorporating symbols that were meaningful to him. They spent the rest of that day and evening going through the logbook, reading passages aloud, sharing memories that the entries triggered. Each notation about a good fishing day or a challenging navigation problem became an opportunity to remember their father's voice, his laugh, his particular way of seeing the world. The grief was still there, sharp and painful, but it was now mixed with something else. Gratitude for having these final messages, comfort in knowing he had thought of them, pride in carrying forward his legacy. Before Sarah returned to base, her mother pulled her aside for a private conversation. She told Sarah that she had been worried about her daughter's decision to join the military, concerned that Sarah was running from grief rather than processing it. But seeing the tattoo's meaning revealed, learning about Commander Stone's role, understanding the opportunity Sarah had been offered, she now believed this path was exactly right. Sarah was doing what her father had done, facing something dangerous and unpredictable, driven by duty and the desire to help others. It was in her blood, inherited not just genetically, but culturally, passed down through stories and lessons and examples. Sarah returned to complete her basic training with a clarity of purpose that impressed everyone around her. She graduated at the top of her class, earning commendations for both physical performance and leadership potential. At the graduation ceremony, Commander Stone was present as a guest speaker. When Sarah walked across the stage to receive her certificate, the commander publicly acknowledged her as an example of why the military needed people who understood sacrifice, who had personal reasons to serve, who brought not just physical capabilities but deep emotional intelligence to their work. After the ceremony, Commander Stone pulled Sarah aside. He told her that he had done more research into that night 5 years ago, accessing files that had remained classified. He wanted her to know the complete truth before she began her specialized training. His ship had been in those waters as part of a security operation, monitoring potential threats from foreign vessels. When the storm hit and distress calls came in, his crew had to make a choice between continuing their mission and responding to civilian emergencies. He had chosen to abandon the mission and respond to the distress calls, a decision that had been controversial in some military circles. Some superiors felt he had compromised operational security. Others argued that saving civilian lives should always take priority. The debate had been one reason why the operation's details remained classified. But the commander had never regretted his choice, only regretted that he couldn't save everyone. He wanted Sarah to understand something crucial as she entered specialized training. In maritime operations, in search and rescue, in any situation where human lives hung in the balance, she would face impossible choices. She would make decisions with incomplete information. She would do everything right and still experience loss. The ocean, like any dangerous environment, didn't care about effort or intention. It simply was, powerful and indifferent. And humans could only do their best to work within its rules. Sarah thanked him for his honesty. She told him that her father had understood those realities, that fishermen lived with that knowledge every day. She wasn't entering this path with illusions about always succeeding or saving everyone. But if she could make a difference in even one situation, if she could bring one family closure instead of leaving them with eternal questions, it would be worth it. The specialized training proved to be everything Lieutenant Hayes had warned and more. Sarah reported to a coastal facility where she joined 20 other candidates selected from across the military branches. The instructors were veterans of countless operations, people who had seen the best and worst of what humans could achieve in dangerous environments. They were tough, demanding, and utterly committed to producing graduates who could handle real-world crisis situations. The physical demands were crushing. Open water swims in challenging conditions, dive training in dark, murky water, rescue simulations with weighted dummies that had to be brought to surface without drowning yourself. Sarah's childhood by the ocean helped, but this was professional-level work that required techniques and skills far beyond anything a fisherman's daughter would naturally possess. She studied obsessively, practiced during every free moment, pushed through pain and exhaustion that made basic training seem easy by comparison. The mental challenges were equally demanding. They were taught decision-making under pressure, how to assess rapidly changing situations, how to prioritize when multiple people needed help simultaneously. They ran through scenarios where there were no good choices, only less terrible ones. They learned about survivor's guilt, about the psychological impact of losing people despite your best efforts, about how to process trauma and continue functioning. Sarah's tattoo became known among her training class. Unlike in basic training where she had kept its meaning private, here she shared the full story. These were people who would potentially work with her in life or death situations. They needed to understand what drove her, what strengths and vulnerabilities she brought to the team. Her classmates responded with respect and their own stories of loss, of reasons for choosing this difficult path, of personal demons they were trying to transform into professional purpose. One instructor, a grizzled chief petty officer with over 30 years of experience, took particular interest in Sarah. After a grueling rescue simulation where Sarah had performed exceptionally well under pressure, he asked to see her tattoo up close. He studied it carefully, then told her something surprising. He had known her father, not personally, but by reputation. The fishing community and the maritime military community overlapped more than civilians realized. Word got around about good fishermen, about people who understood the ocean's moods, who treated it with proper respect. The chief told Sarah that her father had a reputation for helping other boats in trouble. for sharing information about weather and fishing conditions, for being someone you wanted nearby if things went wrong. That generosity and competence had earned him respect. The fact that his daughter was now training to save lives in the same waters where he had lost his own felt poetically right. The ocean took, but it also gave opportunities for redemption and meaning. Months into the training, Sarah's class received news that they would be participating in a joint exercise with civilian Coast Guard units. It would be their first real-world application of skills, though under controlled conditions with safety measures in place. They would simulate responding to a maritime disaster, coordinating between military and civilian resources, testing communication and decision-making under realistic pressures. The exercise location was announced, and Sarah felt her heart stop. It would take place in the waters off her hometown, the same area where her father's boat had gone down. Some might see this as cruel coincidence, but Sarah understood it differently. This was the ocean offering her a chance to face her deepest fear, to return to the place of her greatest loss, not as a grieving daughter, but as a trained professional, capable of helping others. The night before the exercise, Sarah couldn't sleep. She stood on the deck of the ship, looking out at dark water that stretched to the horizon. The ocean was calm that night, gentle waves reflecting moonlight, giving no hint of its capacity for violence. She thought about her father standing on the deck of the Sea Promise, looking at these same waters, perhaps on nights when they were peaceful like this, perhaps wondering what tomorrow's weather would bring. She traced her tattoo, a gesture that had become unconscious habit over the years. The symbols her father had taught her, the waves that represented his world, the hidden initials of the men who died with him. But now the tattoo meant something additional. It represented her own journey from loss to purpose, from grief to service, from being someone who things happened to someone who could affect outcomes for others. The exercise began at dawn. Sarah's team was assigned to respond to a simulated boat in distress, coordinate with other units, and execute a rescue while managing complications like injured survivors and difficult sea conditions. Everything Sarah had learned over months of training came into play. Communication protocols, navigation techniques, rescue procedures, team coordination, medical assessment, all of it flowing together in a complex dance of practiced expertise. At one point during the exercise, Sarah found herself in the water, helping secure a rescue basket to extract a simulated casualty. The water was cold, the waves larger than the calm conditions suggested, and for just a moment, she felt panic rising. This was the ocean that killed her father. These were the waters that had shown no mercy. But then training took over, muscle memory and practice technique, and she completed her task efficiently and safely. When the exercise concluded and they returned to shore, Sarah's instructors gathered the team for a debrief. They analyzed performance, identified areas for improvement, acknowledged successful execution of challenging procedures. Sarah received praise for her calm decision-making and effective communication under pressure. But what mattered more to her than any evaluation was the feeling of accomplishment, of having faced her fear and discovered she was stronger than it. That evening, Sarah drove into her hometown. She hadn't told her mother she would be nearby, wanting to process this experience privately first. She walked to the dock where her father's boat used to tie up, a place she had avoided for years because it hurt too much. The dock was weathered now, some of the wood replaced, small changes that marked time's passage. She sat at the edge, legs dangling over the water, and talked to her father. Not out loud, but in her mind, the way she had done sometimes as a teenager when missing him felt overwhelming. She told him about the training, about the exercise, about choosing to work with the element that took him. She told him that she understood now why he went out despite the dangers, why the ocean called to certain people despite its ruthlessness. It wasn't about courting death or being reckless. It was about respecting something powerful while still engaging with it, about knowing risks but believing the purpose was worth it. She told him that she had his letter, that the whole family did, and that his final words had given them what they needed to truly begin healing. She told him that she was going to complete this training and become someone who helped prevent other families from experiencing unexplained loss. She couldn't save everyone, just as he couldn't control the weather. But she could try, and the trying mattered. As she sat there, an older fisherman walked by, recognized her, and stopped to offer condolences despite the years that had passed. He had known her father, had been part of the search efforts when the Sea Promise went missing. He told Sarah that he thought of her father every time he went out, that losing crew members stayed with you, reminded you to be careful, to respect the ocean's power. Then he noticed her tattoo. He leaned in to look more closely, and his eyes widened with recognition. He asked Sarah where she learned those symbols, that pattern. When she explained her father had taught her, the fisherman nodded slowly. He told her that what she carried on her arm was a traditional fisherman's notation system, passed down through generations, used by mariners for centuries. Most young people didn't learn it anymore, now that GPS and modern technology made the old ways seem obsolete. But the old ways still had value, he explained. They represented accumulated wisdom, patterns observed over lifetimes, understanding that came from intimate relationship with the sea. The fact that Sarah's father had taught her these symbols, and that she had preserved them in her tattoo, meant something important. It meant the knowledge wouldn't be completely lost, that one more person in the world could read the ocean's language. Sarah thanked him and asked if he thought her father would be proud of what she was doing. The fisherman smiled, a weathered expression full of years of sun and salt. He told her that any father would be proud of a daughter who turned grief into strength, who chose to serve and protect others, who respected her father's world enough to learn its deepest lessons. Then he squeezed her shoulder gently and walked away, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the sound of water against the dock pilings. Sarah completed her specialized training 3 months later, graduating with honors. The ceremony was smaller than basic training graduation, more intimate, attended by family members who understood what their graduates had accomplished. Sarah's mother and Tommy came, sitting in the front row, Tommy wearing one of their father's old fishing caps that he had found in the garage. When Sarah received her certificate and qualification insignia, Commander Stone was there to present it. He shook her hand formally, but his eyes conveyed deeper meaning. They had both been changed by that parade ground meeting months ago, by the revelation that connected past tragedy to present purpose. He told her quietly that he expected great things from her, that she had the potential to save many lives and make a real difference. After the ceremony, Sarah's family joined her for a small celebration. Her mother had brought a cake, Tommy had made a card, and they sat together in a hotel restaurant feeling both pride and bittersweet awareness. Sarah's father should have been there. He should have seen his daughter in her uniform, should have heard about her achievements, should have offered his own rough wisdom about staying safe and being smart. But in his absence, his influence was still felt, still shaping Sarah's choices and capabilities. Tommy, now 15 and increasingly mature, told Sarah that he had decided what he wanted to do after high school. He wanted to study marine biology, to understand the ocean scientifically, to contribute to conservation and protection of the ecosystems their father had depended on. It was his way of honoring their father's memory, different from Sarah's path, but equally valid. Their mother smiled through tears, seeing both her children finding ways to transform loss into positive action. Sarah's first assignment after completing training was to a maritime operations unit based on the East Coast. Her work involved coordinating search and rescue operations, training civilian responders, and participating in actual emergency responses when needed. The work was demanding and sometimes heartbreaking. Not every operation succeeded. Not every missing person was found alive or found at all. Sarah learned to carry those losses without letting them destroy her, to honor the people she couldn't save by being better prepared for the next crisis. Her tattoo remained a topic of conversation among colleagues and the people she trained. She had learned to share its meaning openly now, understanding that vulnerability could be a strength, that personal experience informed professional excellence. When teaching civilian boaters about ocean safety, she would sometimes roll up her sleeve and use her tattoo as a teaching tool, explaining the symbols, the patterns, the accumulated wisdom it represented. She became known as someone who understood both the technical aspects of maritime rescue and the emotional dimensions of loss and trauma. Families of missing mariners sometimes requested to speak with her specifically, finding comfort in talking with someone who had been where they were, who understood the particular agony of losing someone to the sea. Sarah offered what comfort she could, honest about the realities while still providing hope where appropriate. 2 years after completing her training, Sarah participated in a rescue operation that would define her career. A fishing vessel had capsized in rough seas, throwing its crew of 5 into the water. The conditions were challenging. Night falling, waves reaching dangerous heights, the kind of situation where rescue operations often became recovery missions. But Sarah's team responded quickly, coordinated effectively, and managed to locate and extract all 5 crew members alive. One of the rescued fishermen, pulled from the water hypothermic but conscious, grabbed Sarah's arm as they loaded him onto the helicopter. He thanked her, his teeth chattering, his grip surprisingly strong. That's when he saw her tattoo, water-slicked and visible in the helicopter's interior lights. He asked about it, and Sarah gave the short version, explaining it honored her father, who had been lost at sea. The fisherman started crying, not from his own trauma but from emotion at being saved by someone who understood so personally what his death would have meant to his family. He told Sarah that she had given his children what hers had lost, a father who came home. That moment, more than any commendation or official recognition, confirmed for Sarah that she had found her purpose. Commander Stone, now promoted to admiral and working in naval operations planning, received regular reports about Sarah's performance. He followed her career with an almost paternal interest, feeling that her success validated his decision to reveal the truth about her father's death, to offer her specialized training, to support her path forward. He sometimes wondered if their meeting had been pure chance or something more, the universe's way of correcting old mistakes, of turning tragedy into eventual triumph. On the 5th anniversary of receiving her father's letter and belongings, Sarah took leave and returned home. Her family gathered at the dock where her father used to work, and together they performed a small ceremony. They had commissioned a bronze plaque that was mounted on the dock's main post, listing the names of the 4 crew members lost from the Sea Promise and acknowledging their service to the community and their families. Sarah's mother spoke about her husband, sharing memories that made them laugh and cry. Tommy, now preparing for college in his marine biology studies, read a poem he had written about the ocean's dual nature as provider and taker. And Sarah explained how she had taken her grief and her father's lessons and transformed them into a career saving others. How she carried him with her literally and figuratively into dangerous situations. How his death had ultimately led to life for people who might otherwise have been lost. As the ceremony concluded and other community members who had known the lost crew members came forward to pay respects, Sarah stood looking out at the ocean. It stretched endlessly, beautiful and terrible, the same as it had always been. But she saw it differently now, not as an enemy that stole her father, but as a force of nature that demanded respect, skill, and sometimes sacrifice. Her father had understood that. Now, she did too. Her tattoo caught the afternoon sunlight, the waves seeming almost to move across her skin. People no longer asked what it meant with casual curiosity. Those who knew her story understood it represented loss and love, memory and mission, past grief and present purpose. It was a map of her journey from broken teenager to capable professional, from victim of circumstance to someone who actively shaped outcomes. Commander Stone, now Admiral Stone, had sent a letter that Sarah's mother handed her during the ceremony. In it, he expressed his continued admiration for Sarah's service and his gratitude that their chance meeting had allowed old wrongs to be partially righted. He mentioned that he was working on policy changes that would prevent similar bureaucratic failures in the future, ensuring that items recovered during rescue operations would be promptly returned to families. It was a small systemic change, but one that might spare others the years of unknowing that Sarah's family had endured. The letter concluded with a passage that brought tears to Sarah's eyes. The Admiral wrote that he had learned something profound from knowing her. He had carried guilt about that failed rescue for years, feeling he had let down the families of the lost crew. But seeing how Sarah had transformed her loss, how she had taken the worst moment of her life and built something meaningful from it, had taught him that we don't always control outcomes, but we always control our response. We can let tragedy define us, or we can define what the tragedy means. That evening, Sarah sat with her family in their living room, the same space where they had opened the container with her father's belongings 2 years earlier. They talked about their father and husband, sharing memories, both sad and joyful, acknowledging that he would always be missed, but that missing him no longer paralyzed them. They had found ways to live fully while still honoring his memory, to move forward while carrying him with them. Before leaving to return to her base, Sarah visited her father's grave for the first time in years. She had avoided the cemetery, finding it too painful, preferring to remember him in places he had loved, like the dock and the beach. But now she felt ready to face even this, the marker that acknowledged his death while celebrating his life. She told him about her work, about the people she had helped save, about the family she had kept together by bringing home fathers and mothers and children who might otherwise have been lost. She told him that she finally understood why he went to sea despite the dangers, why he did what he did. Purpose and duty and love for family were powerful forces, worth facing risk to honor. As she traced her tattoo one final time before leaving, Sarah realized something profound. The tattoo had brought her to Commander Stone, who had given her the truth about her father's death. That truth had led to specialized training, which led to her current work, which had saved lives that would otherwise have been lost. Her father's death had been random tragedy, meaningless suffering. But the chain of events that followed, the meaning she had created from meaninglessness, had resulted in good that her father himself could never have imagined. The tattoo was no longer just a memorial. It was a testament to the human ability to find light in darkness, to create meaning from chaos, to transform private grief into public service. It was visible proof that love persists beyond death, that teaching echoes across time, that even in our losses we can find seeds of redemption if we're brave enough to plant them. Sarah drove back to her base that night, her mind at peace in ways it hadn't been for 7 years. The road stretched ahead, illuminated by her headlights, and she felt her father's presence not as an absence but as a foundation, the ground she stood on, the strength she drew from when challenges arose. He had given her more than she realized while he was alive, and she was spending her life honoring that gift by giving others the chance to continue their own stories. The tattoo on her arm was a map, a language, a memorial, and a mission statement all at once. It had gone from private symbol to public revelation, from personal grief to shared understanding. And though no one could have predicted the journey it would catalyze, Sarah now understood that some things happen exactly as they're meant to, even when the path includes unbearable pain. The meaning we make from suffering is perhaps the most powerful meaning of all.